Before we begin, take a deep breath and settle in. Tonight, we're going back to 1621 to see what the real first Thanksgiving was actually like. 3 days of tension, survival, and uneasy cooperation that looked nothing like the holiday we know today. If you enjoy these journeys, please subscribe and comment where you're listening from. The year leading up to the first Thanksgiving was nothing like the simple story most people imagine. Before there was a feast, there was a winter so harsh that half the Pilgrims died within months of landing. Graves were dug at night and disguised by leveling the ground so nearby, tribes wouldn't see how weakened the colony had become. By autumn of 1621, grief still hung over Plymouth like a low, heavy fog. The settlement itself was small, just a few rough houses, a communal building, and dirt paths worn by months of constant work. Meals were simple: cornmeal mush, dried fish, small portions of squash. Nothing felt secure, but compared to the misery of their first year, even this thin stability felt like progress. Their survival wasn't achieved alone. The Wampanoag, recovering from devastating plague years of their own, had helped the Pilgrims plant corn, identify safe plants, and navigate the harsh coastline. The two groups existed in a fragile balance, peaceful but cautious. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both understood the necessity of cooperation. By late autumn, Governor William Bradford looked over their first successful harvest: corn, beans, pumpkins, and a little fish, and saw something they had never had before. Enough food to believe they might endure the coming winter. Not comfortably, but possibly. Edward Winslow suggested they mark the moment with a gathering of thanks, a tradition the Pilgrims had practiced in England after successful harvests. Bradford agreed. The settlement desperately needed a pause from survival, a chance to breathe. Preparations were simple. The Pilgrims had no sugar, no butter, no traditional pies. Their tools were few, their pots small. Women cooked rough corn cakes and stews with dried vegetables. Men gathered what game they could, ducks and geese mostly, plucked and roasted over open fires. The smell drifted through the settlement, mixing with the smoke of fresh-cut wood. They expected a small, quiet meal, but the forest had other plans. Early that morning, Miles Standish noticed movement at the tree line, shadows shifting in a way wind couldn't explain. At first, he thought it was deer. Then he saw them clearly. Wampanoag men emerging from the woods, stepping into the clearing with calm, deliberate steps. At their front was Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem who had helped forge the fragile alliance months earlier. Behind him came dozens more, warriors, hunters, families, far more people than the Pilgrims had prepared food for. The Pilgrims hadn't invited them, but they hadn't discouraged them either. A ripple of tension moved through the settlement. Muskets weren't raised, but hands hovered near them. The Pilgrims didn't know why so many had come. They didn't know if this gathering was peaceful or political. But Massasoit raised his hand in greeting, and Bradford stepped forward to meet him. the air eased slightly. Not into comfort, but into a wary cooperation that both sides had become accustomed to. The Pilgrims quickly realized their small meal wouldn't be enough for the unexpected crowd. They had prepared what they could, but their supplies were limited. Massasoit noticed, and without hesitation, he acted. Several of his men turned back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. The Pilgrims watched, unsure what this meant. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the warriors returned, dragging deer, bringing baskets of corn, nuts, and smoked fish. The Pilgrims were stunned. Their small harvest meal had transformed into a massive gathering, larger than anything they had imagined or planned. The first day of the real Thanksgiving had begun, not as a holiday, but as a meeting of two worlds, each carrying caution, necessity, and the fragile hope of survival. The Pilgrims hadn't expected the Wampanoag to arrive at all, much less in such large numbers. Their plan for a modest harvest meal unraveled the moment Massasoit and his warriors stepped into the clearing. Still, the Pilgrims tried to move with calm, greeting the Wampanoag and offering what little food they had prepared. It wasn't much: corn cakes, small servings of roasted fowl, a few pots of stew simmering over low fires. What the Pilgrims did next, however, changed the entire course of the day. They fired guns. It wasn't an attack, more of a salute, a celebratory custom from Europe, a way of signaling honor and festivity. But to the Wampanoag, the sound cut sharply through the air, echoing across the clearing with a force that made several warriors straighten immediately. Muskets cracked one after another, sending bursts of smoke drifting through the cool autumn air. The Pilgrims cheered. The Wampanoag reached for their weapons on instinct. Misunderstanding hovered in the air like smoke. Massasoit, watching carefully, raised his hand. His warriors relaxed, though their eyes stayed sharp. The Pilgrims, realizing belatedly that their gesture hadn't translated well, lowered their muskets and offered awkward smiles. Still, the tension eased slowly. Food did what words struggled to accomplish. The Pilgrims handed out their small portions, thin cuts of goose and duck, rough cornbread, small bowls of boiled vegetables. The Wampanoag accepted them with polite expressions, but it was clear the Pilgrims did not have nearly enough to feed over 90 Wampanoag guests. Massasoit said little, but he observed everything. The thinness of the Pilgrims' harvest, their cautious glances, their sincerity mixed with fear, and the undeniable truth that this gathering was too big for one struggling colony to host alone. So, he made a decision. He sent his hunters back into the forest with swift, purposeful steps. The Pilgrims watched them disappear between the tall pines, unsure what it meant. They whispered among themselves, wondering if the Wampanoag were leaving, if they felt insulted, or if the day would unravel into silence and suspicion. Instead, after an hour, the hunters returned, carrying 5 deer. The carcasses were heavy, shoulders shaking under the weight. steam rising as cold air met warm flesh. Behind them came baskets filled with nuts, dried berries, corn, and smoked fish. The pilgrims stared in stunned disbelief. This single offering outweighed everything they had prepared. The meal transformed instantly. Not a celebration the pilgrims hosted, but a shared effort. Wampanoag cooks prepared venison over open flames, seasoning it with gathered herbs. They roasted fish, cracked open nuts, and laid out dried fruits. The pilgrims contributed what they could, their small harvest of pumpkins, a few pots of boiled corn, the last of their game birds. Slowly, as firelight warmed the clearing, the mood shifted. The defensive glances faded. The nervous silence lifted. Conversation began. Not fluent, not seamless, but earnest. Children wandered between groups, laughing with the ease adults hadn't yet mastered. Dogs picked their way through the crowd, tails wagging as scraps fell to the dirt. Smoke drifted upward in soft grey ribbons, blending the scents of pilgrim stews and Wampanoag venison. Massasoit sat with Bradford, both men speaking through interpreters. Their dialogue was slow, respectful, careful. The alliance between their people had already been tested more than once, and both sides knew mutual survival depended on its stability. As dusk settled in, the fires glowed brighter. Drums from the Wampanoag side tapped a gentle rhythm. Some of the pilgrims, unused to music of any kind outside worship, watched with cautious curiosity. Others simply sat, warming their hands by the flames, grateful for the abundance they hadn't expected. Day one ended not with a grand announcement, nor with any sense that they had created a future holiday. It ended quietly, with full stomachs, tired bodies, and an uneasy but growing trust between two worlds. The pilgrims had survived their first year. The Wampanoag had helped them make it through. And on that first evening of the feast, both sides understood. Tomorrow would be bigger. The second day of the gathering began before the sun fully cleared the tops of the pines. A thin mist rolled across the clearing, softening the outlines of houses and turning the fire's smoke into drifting white columns. Both the pilgrims and the Wampanoag moved slowly at first. They had eaten more in one day than many had eaten in weeks, and the warmth of the large fires had lulled everyone into a deep, needed sleep. But day two brought a different energy, livelier, louder, more unpredictable. Wampanoag hunters left early, slipping into the forest with the same smooth silence they had shown the day before. The pilgrims, watching them disappear again, wondered whether this was simply part of the tradition, or if Massasoit sensed they still needed more food than the pilgrims could provide. Whatever the reason, the hunters returned hours later with wild fowl, fish, and more venison, enough to keep the fires burning all day. This time, the pilgrims contributed more actively. Men gathered firewood, repaired cooking pits, and cleaned their muskets. Women prepared stews, crushed dried corn, and cooked rough loaves of hard bread. Children carried water from the stream, their breath turning white in the cool air. But the second day was about more than food. Slowly, the gathering took on a social rhythm neither side had planned. It began with games. Some of the younger Wampanoag men set up a target of woven reeds and took turns firing arrows at it. Their movements were fluid, bowstrings snapping softly, arrows humming through the air with near-perfect accuracy. Pilgrim men watched with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. They were not used to seeing weapons handled so gracefully outside of battle. Still, one or two stepped forward, eager to try. It did not go well. Their arrows flew short or wildly off target, and the Wampanoag hid smiles behind their hands. One of the youngest warriors retrieved a stray arrow and demonstrated proper stance, turning it into a friendly lesson rather than a competition. Even Standish, ever wary, nodded in appreciation. Then it was the Pilgrims' turn. They set up targets for musket shooting, explaining how their weapons worked. The Wampanoag examined the heavy guns with curiosity, touching the wooden stocks, smelling the powder, weighing the unfamiliar tools in their hands. When the Pilgrims fired, the blasts echoed across the clearing once again, but this time the Wampanoag didn't reach for their own weapons. They simply watched the smoke drift upward and nodded. The two groups spent much of the afternoon sharing simple contests, foot races, strength tests, small challenges of skill. Children joined freely, darting between legs, squealing as older cousins chased them across the beaten dirt paths. The forest, so often quiet and tense, echoed with laughter that surprised even the Pilgrims. Still, beneath the warmth of the day, a subtle awareness remained. The Pilgrims relied heavily on the Wampanoag for food. The Wampanoag understood that their alliance was becoming political. Both sides watched each other carefully, even while smiling. Massasoit and Bradford met again near one of the larger fires. They spoke through interpreters about land, winter preparations, trade, and the fragile peace they hoped to maintain. The conversations were deliberate, quiet, threaded with the understanding that neither group could afford conflict. Later, as the fires burned hot and steady, a few Wampanoag men began a quiet chant. It wasn't loud, just soft, rhythmic, carried gently on the wind. Some pilgrims listened curiously, unsure whether this was music or ceremony, while others sat back and simply absorbed the steady, soothing cadence. Food circulated all day. Fresh venison roasted slowly on wooden stakes. Pilgrim stews bubbled in iron pots. The scent of herbs and smoke clung to everything: clothes, hair, the ground itself. Dogs settled near the fires, eyes half closed, waiting for scraps. Toward late afternoon, the mood settled into something surprisingly peaceful. For a brief moment, the two groups, so different in language, belief, and custom, shared the clearing without tension. The crackle of fire, the hum of conversation, the cool air against warming skin, all blended into an atmosphere almost gentle. But even in that gentleness, no one forgot reality. The Pilgrims remembered their dead. The Wampanoag remembered the plague that had emptied entire villages. Both sides knew the winter ahead would test them again. Yet day 2 of the feast offered something rare, a pause in conflict, a moment of connection, a fragile but genuine sense of harmony. As night settled and stars brightened over the clearing, the fires dimmed into glowing mounds of red ash. People drifted to their shelters, full and tired. Only the last embers and the whisper of the forest remained awake. Day 3 was coming, and with it, the unspoken purpose behind the feast. Day 3 began with a calm, grey morning. Mist drifted across the clearing, softening the outlines of the houses and blurring the edges of the forest. The fires from the previous night still glowed faintly, giving off thin ribbons of smoke. Both groups, Pilgrims and Wampanoag, moved slowly, worn out from 2 long days of eating, talking, and working. The last day felt different from the first 2, quieter, more deliberate. Everyone sensed that this day wasn't about food anymore. Bradford, Winslow, and Standish gathered with Massasoit and several Wampanoag leaders near the largest fire. Interpreters settled between them, and the conversations began, not in celebration, but in negotiation. Their alliance had been fragile from the start, and winter was coming again. Both sides needed reassurance that their survival would remain tied together. The Wampanoag faced pressure from nearby tribes. The Pilgrims faced another winter with little food. This meeting mattered. While the leaders spoke, the rest of the camp eased into a steady rhythm. Wampanoag hunters brought in more game, birds, fish, and a small deer, recognizing that the Pilgrims had almost nothing left to offer from their harvest. Pilgrim women warmed leftover stews and mashed pumpkins into simple dishes. Children wandered between groups, carrying sticks, trailing smoke, and laughing in ways the adults rarely did. There were no pies or sweets, no big tables, no baked goods, just the foods the land provided: venison, fish, corn, nuts, and pumpkins cooked over open fires. The Pilgrims contributed what they had left. The Wampanoag filled in the rest. The mood was peaceful but watchful, friendly but not familiar. 2 worlds trying to understand each other. In the afternoon, small games resumed. Archery demonstrations, musket firing, and friendly foot races across the open field. Laughter drifted through the clearing again, softer than the day before, but warm enough to ease the tiredness in everyone's bones. By late day, the conversations between leaders reached a quiet agreement. Both sides reaffirmed the peace treaty. Both agreed to protect each other if attacked. Both promised to continue trading food, tools, and knowledge. It wasn't a holiday. It was an alliance meeting wrapped in a feast. As the light faded, families began packing baskets. Hunters gathered their gear. Warriors tightened the straps on their quivers. When Massasoit finally rose, the entire Wampanoag group followed with calm coordination, moving toward the forest with silent steps. There was no dramatic farewell, no ceremony, just a steady departure. figures slipping back between the trees as easily as they had emerged. Soon the clearing felt strangely empty, the fires crackling quietly in their absence. The pilgrims looked around at the scattered bones, the trampled dirt, the remains of roasted venison, and realized just how much the Wampanoag had contributed. Without them, there would have been no feast at all, just a modest meal and a long winter of uncertainty. Bradford stood at the edge of the field, watching the last wisps of smoke twist into the cooling sky. He knew the feast had not been a grand celebration. It had been a fragile moment of cooperation between two struggling peoples, each carrying wounds from the year before. And yet, for 3 days, they had shared fire, food, and cautious trust. The real first Thanksgiving wasn't a cheerful holiday. It wasn't a peaceful gathering of equals. It was two communities, both weakened, trying to survive another winter. Still, something meaningful had happened. They sat together. They talked. They helped each other. As the pilgrims returned to their houses and the fires dimmed into glowing embers, one truth settled quietly over the settlement. This feast had not solved their problems, but it had given them the hope to face what came next. When the last fires from the feast finally dimmed, the settlement returned to its familiar quiet. The pilgrims stood in the cooling dusk, watching thin threads of smoke drift across the clearing. The fields were scattered with footprints, bones, and fading impressions of where Wampanoag families had sat. It felt almost unreal that so many people had gathered in a place usually so silent. The Wampanoag were already deep within the forest, their steps swallowed by the pines. Their presence had carried the feast, providing most of the food, guiding the rhythm of each day, and giving the pilgrims a sense of stability they hadn't felt since landing in the new world. Now, with them gone, the weight of survival settled heavily again. Inside the small houses, the pilgrims swept out the ashes, cleaned their tools, and put away their wooden bowls. Their bodies ached from eating more than usual, working harder, and staying awake late into the night. But their spirits felt different, steadier somehow, as if the feast had stitched a thin thread of confidence through the otherwise frayed fabric of the colony. Bradford and Winslow walked the perimeter of the settlement as the sky darkened. They paused several times, looking out toward the distant tree line where the Wampanoag had disappeared earlier. Neither man spoke at first. The air held the heavy quiet of reflection. At length, Bradford exhaled and said, "We are not alone in this land." Winslow nodded. "Nor can we pretend to be." They understood the reality clearly now. The colony's survival depended on more than hard work and faith. It depended on relationships, uneasy alliances built through shared meals, negotiations, and the fragile trust that had shaped the past 3 days. The pilgrims didn't think they had created a holiday. They didn't expect anyone to remember the feast centuries later. To them, it had been a brief moment of peace carved out of a difficult year. As night swept in, a cold breeze slipped between the houses. Winter was coming again, and with it came the same fears they'd carried since landing. Sickness, hunger, storms. But the feast had given them clarity. The Wampanoag were not simply neighbours, they were essential partners. And the Pilgrims, though small in number, had something to offer as well. Tools, alliances, and the willingness to learn. Inside one of the houses, a small candle flickered beside Bradford's journal. He sat at a rough wooden table and wrote down the events of the past days. His handwriting was tired but steady, the ink pooling slightly where his hands trembled from the cold. He described the games, the meals, the cooperation, the negotiations, each detail captured carefully, as though he knew the memory would matter someday. He wrote of Massasoits, calm, presence, the hunters moving silently through the trees, the soft rhythm of Wampanoag chants drifting across the clearing at dusk. He wrote of the children laughing, the fire crackling, the uneasy looks that softened with time. But he also wrote of the truth. The Pilgrims had little food of their own. Their harvest was small. Their people were few. The feast had not been one of excess or comfort. It had been one of necessity, one where the Wampanoag had provided the majority of what was eaten. When he finished, Bradford closed the journal gently, letting the sound echo softly in the small room. Outside, a thin frost settled over the ground, sparkling beneath the moonlight. The settlement slept lightly, as it always did, listening for the wind, the wolves, the shifting river. But tonight, the cold felt less threatening. They had endured a winter once before. This time, they had partners. This time, they had a chance. No one in Plymouth thought the feast would be remembered. No one imagined it would grow into a national symbol. No one believed it would become a story told for centuries. To them, it was a simple truth. 3 days of cautious peace in a land that had given them nothing easily. 3 days where two wounded peoples found a way to sit together. 3 days where the fires burned bright enough to push back the coming winter. The real first Thanksgiving wasn't a celebration of abundance. It was a quiet acknowledgement of survival and the hope that survival might continue.